Well, you get the general idea. We have to be very quiet because the cattle are asleep and we don't want them to wake up and stampede. Then it's a total mess. Welcome to part 2 of the Vaqueros and the Cowboys. As you remember the last time, we learned that, or we were reminded that Columbus found both North America and South America. And because he was sponsored by Spain, there was a big Spanish influence in both countries. The Spanish mostly lived in the South American part. And when they started to come into South America, they brought with them their cattle, they brought with them their horses, and they began to set up ranches as time went by. So they had these big haciendas, these big ranches, and they hired vaqueros to round up the cattle and tame the horses. And because the horses were wild, they just let them run. And after a period of time, there were many, like millions of wild horses, wild cows. Well, I always wondered as a little kid, when you see cowboy and Indian movies, where the Indians got their horses, because there were not any horses here. Well, that's where they got them. They also found that there were horses, wild horses, and the Indians got their horses from the Spanish people. And of course, Spain owned clear up almost to, probably up to Oregon, all through Texas, South, in New Mexico, Arizona, California, all of that was owned by Spain. So this big Spanish section of what we call America today was owned by Spain, So anyway, the vaqueros were busy rounding up horses. And just like the cowboys in America, the cowboys were rounding up horses too. So you think with the cowboys and Indians, the Indians are always, after the cowboys, and the cowboys are always after the Indians. And it was true, they were at odds with one another. But that's where the Indians got their horses, is actually from the Spanish people. And then, of course, the cowboys in America, usually they worked for somebody had a big ranch and they wanted more cows, or they were selling their cows and they were having these the selling of cow by the cowboy taking the cow to a station, like a railroad station eventually, but just to a town so they could sell the cattle. And it was big money back in those days. And sometimes the vaqueros did not brand their cattle, but the cowboys did. And so they would brand their cattle with like their initials, or the Lazy J, or the Broken Arrow, or whatever they made up a brand. And then when even if they left their cattle run loose, so to speak, they knew who they were, whose they belonged to, because they had the brand on them. And so because of the traveling and trying to sell these cows from place to place, the cowboys traveled. And as it says in your history book, remember the last time I said, I think it took about a month. Well, I was totally wrong. It took about 4 months to go from out in the wild to a civilized town before they could actually sell the cattle or put them on the railroads or whatever. And so all these little cattle towns started up because they were selling their cattle. And when they were herding their cattle, there were all kinds of cowboys that were necessary. There was the guy that led them was called the trail boss, and he knew the trail. The guy that was the point rider, he was the one that kind of round them up so that they didn't get too wide, because they had to have enough. They were, a cow's wild, and so they had to have a rider all the way around of the herd of cows, or they just go every which way. So there were swing riders, and they would be on the side, and there were flank riders, and they'd be towards the back, and there was a drag rider in the back, and he was the one that picked up all the cows that were, kind of eating too much and not going where they needed to go. So it took a group of cowboys to get the cows from point A to point B so they could be sold. And they were on the trail, and that's how they played the harmonica to calm the cows down at night, especially during a thunderstorm, when the weather was really bad and lots of lightning and the wolves howling or the coyotes howling. It just agitated the cattle. And a stampede was the worst thing because when they stampeded, they went absolutely everywhere. And it took so long to gather them, calm them, and gather them back again. And so the cowboys didn't want to do that. So they were very much into singing. And if you look on page 134, 135, 136 in your My America book, that one right there, if you look in that, you can finish up the chapter and you can see some of the songs that the cowboys sang. I think it ends in about page 130, about 138, 137. So if you'll read that and finish up and kind of look and see maybe some of the songs you've heard before. But cowboys were good singers because they had to keep those cattle quiet. There was a man, and his name was Charles Goodnight. And Charles Goodnight was an interesting man. He was a cattle baron. In other words, he had made money from getting these cows. And he invented the thing called the chuck wagon. And as you know, they had like wagons, like you see the Conestoga wagons with the big white tops, okay, and like the wagon with the big white top, okay. Well, he invented the chuck wagon, and it was full of pots and pans and a little, not a stove, but a thing to make a stove out of, like when they finally stopped. And he had food and places to stack the food and places to put the food, and he was an amazing man. So his cowboys, everyone liked to work for Mr. Goodnight because he had this lovely chuck wagons, and the chuck wagon guy, the cook, he would go way ahead of the cowboys because by this time they knew their trails and so forth, and so he'd go way ahead, and then he'd wait, he'd have all their food ready, and when the cowboys came in at night, then he would have all their dinner ready. And of course, lots of hot coffee in this chuck wagon. So the chuck wagon became a part of the cowboy life. And then all these towns that came, they call them boom towns, not cow towns where they were just basically selling the cattle and leaving. But these were boom towns, and they were towns that boom, they started right up. And so they had a small town, and of course the more people that are there, the more their needs are. So like if they had if you moved in, first of all, you would need some kind of supply store. You need a place for a livery, a place to take care of the horses. So you'd need eventually schools. You'd need a place to buy groceries, a place to buy supplies. You would need a carpenter shop. And so because things were there, more people came, and that's how the towns were started, called boom towns. And it became, the Wild West became known as the Wild West. Almost everybody carried a gun. There was very little law and order. There was a sheriff many times that was finally hired, the sheriff, but usually just one per town. And things were a lot rougher than maybe they are today in many senses. So if you did what was wrong, lots of times there weren't any consequences. So there was hangings and things. Somebody didn't like somebody, and they do men. It really got pretty wild. So it was known as the Wild West, and fun to think about, fun to learn about. But I don't know that it would really be the ideal spot to be in, is to be in this Wild West. Well, I want to go back the next time we talk, and I want to talk a little bit about why the Lord, in all of his wisdom, why it would be that he would allow the white man to overtake the Indian population. Because as you know, the white man came to America, but the Indians were already here, and they had been here for a long time. And so I want to tell you a little bit about why God allowed the white man to take over the Indian land. And today we do have some Native Americans. Usually I can't say always, but many times they're on our reservation. But it's not like it once was. Years ago, the Indians were everywhere, and there was just, there were no white men. So we'll talk about that the next time we're together. Meanwhile, why don't you go ahead and why don't you finish up that chapter, starting at page 134. Finish it up. It's just a couple more pages. Kind of see some of the songs that they used to sing, and maybe Mommy and Daddy can sing them with you. And so we'll visit again next time. Okay, adios.